The Edmonton Oilers finished off the last game of Connor McDavid's suspension in style, winning 3-2 in a come-from-behind fashion against the Buffalo Sabres. All of that on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to this Victory Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet $5, and if you win, score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. On today's show, going to pick apart the 3-2 come-from-behind victory against the Sabres, talk about Stuart Skinner's great performance, and, of course, we'll talk about McDavid returning to the lineup tonight against the Kraken. So, before we start today's show, I had myself one of those good old-school snafus. So, I originally recorded this episode yesterday, Sunday afternoon, before the football game started, so that way I could settle in and watch football and be at peace. But I, for one, did not notice that I had failed to change the audio mapping inputs, meaning I was talking into the microphone I always do the show into, but the software I used to record did not have the microphone selected, and therefore I spent 30 minutes doing an episode that no audio is recorded for. So I'm sorry for the late output of the show today. I know I'd like to have it out for the morning, because that's when people most often consume their podcasts, in the morning, on the way to work, on the way to the gym, on the way to school, at the start of the day. So it behooves me to put out content when people are going to listen to it. So starting with the most obvious, and this has been a recurring theme this year, and it's something I really enjoy talking about in the abstract, in the course of putting together the narrative and the story of a long season. When a team can consistently find ways to win in different ways with different players picking up the slack at various points, that's generally a sign, a very telltale sign of a quality hockey team. Because if you can go 3 games without the best player in the world in the lineup, and you can win 2 of them, and you can win 2 of them in really, I won't say convincing, because Saturday wasn't very convincing, but you can win them in decent fashion and put them away, that matters. And when you're a good team, you want to consistently have different means of winning. You know, we talk about paths to victory, what's your formula, how replicable is it? All of that is interconnected. You want to think about these games, and this applies to any sport, really. Are we only dependent on 1 or 2 guys playing out of their minds every night? If that's our recipe, it's harder to replicate that, because if you're contingent on 1 or 2 players for success, that typically means if those few players aren't successful, you're going to have a harder time. You know, you think about some of the more top-heavy lineups across the NHL, or teams that are overly reliant on, say, their power play or their goaltending. Those teams, their paths to victory on nights where their bread and butter doesn't go, it becomes a lot more challenging. And you look at a team like, say, the Rangers right now, who they've had a nice little run over the last few weeks. I think 7-0-3 in the last 10 games. They had a 10-game point streak going into yesterday when they lost to Colorado in regulation. But on nights where Shesterkin doesn't steal at least 1 goal saved above expected, and they don't score on the power play, they're not going to win. They don't do enough at 5-on-5 to be able to win consistently, and that's why their season has been so night and day. It's been so all over the place. And then you compare that to what the Oilers did. And you never want to be playing from behind. We know fundamentally the way hockey works, the way score impacts work, that if the other team scores first, they are more likely to win the game. We know that statistically. When you go and look, and I went and looked yesterday at all 32 teams' records when the other team scores first, there is a strong correlation between quality teams and being able to make up multi-goal deficits. And multi-goal deficits is a bit misleading, but technically speaking, if you concede the first goal and you want to win the game, you do need to score 2 straight goals. And that's what makes, that's what makes pulling off the comeback challenging, the environmental factors. And this is going to sound really obvious, but if you need to score more than your opponent and they already have more than you need to score more than they do the rest of the game. And you need to tack on one more to that. And when you can consistently find ways to do that, and it's not just the power play, it's not just Leon, it's not just Zach Hyman, it's not just McDavid. Saturday, you got a Jeff Skinner goal against his former team. I know that felt good for Jeff, who's been in and out of the lineup since early December because he just hasn't really found the ideal lineup spot yet. I still think it's probably either riding with McDavid and Hyman, or I think it's probably playing with Adam Henrique and Connor Brown, and they bump Janmark down because I think Jeff Skinner has utility still. And then, you throw in the 2 Ryan Nugent-Hopkins goals. And again, all of that matters in the context of a long season. And I brought up this idea last week, and I want to reiterate it because I think it's something I've pieced together over time and watching hockey. And I'm not that old. I'm only 27, but I've been watching hockey pretty consistently now, 12, 13 years, where every night I'm watching at least one game, if not 2, if not 3. And one of the real benchmarks of a good quality contender is that on any given night, someone in that lineup is capable of being a difference maker. And everybody kind of has a signature moment throughout the course of a long season when you're a special team. When you're capable of winning, 50, 55 regular season games, that's because you had enough depth that you had guys who were able to chip in with a 2-goal game here or there. You think about the Nuge 2-goal game on Saturday, the Adam Henrique 2-goal game a couple weeks ago, Zach Hyman 2-goal game during the week. All of that matters. And one of the components, I should say, of that is it's not always going to be guys who play every game. Someone like Jeff Skinner, who's been in and out of the lineup, it's really easy to lose track. It's really easy to lose focus, to lose sight, and kind of start going through the motions when you don't feel like you're involved. And look, I understand these are professional athletes and there's an expectation that you're always ready when you're asked to play. And I'm not saying Jeff Skinner's not. I'm just saying it's really easy for guys who don't feel like they're part of the process to feel alienated, to start, I don't want to say pulling away, but not being as engaged as they need to be. And Jeff did his job, got them on the board, and they manufactured some offense. And Nuge put some work in. It's really important that you have the capacity for contributions throughout your lineup. It's really one of the telltale signs of a good team having a good season is that you're going to go back and you're going to say, well, yeah, Nuge had the 2-goal game against Buffalo. You'll say Hyman had the 2-goal game against Vancouver. You go on and on and on. But over the course of a long season, a lot of the games get blurred to your memory, and you'll remember specific goals, specific save, a specific block shot at a crucial juncture in the game. All of that type of stuff will stick in your brain. And that does matter, because when you talk about the season and you want to piece together what worked, what didn't work when the season ends, do you have these moments you can point to and say, well, I knew this team was different when they beat the Kings 1-0 2 weeks ago. And then a week later, they managed to come back from 3 goals down against Minnesota. Those types of difference in the wins matter because it shows the capacity to be prepared for anything. So we're going to take our first break of today's show. We come back, we'll talk about Stuart Skinner's great game. And that fits within the context of everybody having moments right after this. So be sure to stick around. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game. Chiefs, Eagles, again. Endless possibilities, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling MVP, or even betting on the coin toss. FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action with live betting all game long. You can adjust your bets as the game develops and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, the icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. The Chiefs, 1.5-point favorites in the Super Bowl against the Eagles. The Super Bowl, of course, is a neutral site game in New Orleans this year. The Chiefs, slight favorites to go for 3 straight Super Bowls. Bet $5, and if you win, you can score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Victory Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. Of course, like I said at the outro, in the intro, meant for this to come out Monday morning, but posting a podcast with no audio would not have gone well because A, there's nothing to listen to, and B, if you clicked on the YouTube video and you just saw my mouth moving, you wouldn't stay watching the video very long. So that wouldn't have been helpful for anybody. So you got to do it right, even if it's a little inconvenient, even if it's maybe going to mess things up for you in terms of the week. But as far as the Oilers, I think a lot of the conversation around Stuart Skinner is driven by people not in the Edmonton market, and it's driven by people who have a casual understanding of sports. And I don't want to turn this into a referendum on digital conversation, because the problems within sports media conversation online are just a reflection of society at large, where no one wants to make any attempt to understand anyone. But I don't think the conversation around Stuart Skinner is particularly insightful. I think people, if they are not familiar with the Oilers and kind of the Oilers' way of doing things from a roster perspective and then from a play perspective, they look at the numbers. You know, he's 27th in goals saved above expected. His save and goals above average are fine. And they say, well, if the Oilers are a Stanley Cup contender, why don't they go get a real goalie? Why don't they go get somebody with a track record? And I'm going to say, counterpoint, you get what you pay for. One of the perceived benefits of paying for something that's expensive is there is an inherent implied quality to whatever it is. If it's a car, if it's a designer, luxury good, there's an understanding that because you're paying for it and you're paying a lot for it, it's going to end up being more worth it. It's going to last longer. It's better made. It looks better, whatever. And the Oilers aren't paying a lot for their goaltending situation. You know, Skinner and I almost said Jack Campbell, excuse me. Skinner and Calvin Pickard combined are, I think, the 28th most expensive cap hit for a goalie room in the NHL. They're a bottom 5 goalie team in terms of salary. And the Oilers feel the variance within the goaltender position means it doesn't make a lot of sense to pay a ton for the position if they can spend that money better elsewhere. And really, this is one of the few ways you get an understanding of what your team values. And most teams play things extremely close to the vest. You don't really get a good feel for what they think about certain skill sets, certain players, but how they choose to build their roster and what they choose to spend money on, that is one of the ways you get an understanding of what these people think on a fundamental level. You know, how much are we spending on this versus that? That is a direct way to show, hey, I think we win in today's NHL by spending money on offense. Well, I think we spend money on goaltending or defense. And how that plays out is one of the storylines within a given season. You know, we all rush after a team wins the Stanley Cup to try and make the Panthers won because, they swung the Matthew Tkachuk trade. They had a mastery understanding of free agency. They bought low on a bunch of guys. They were able to spend on important positions, but not go crazy. They were able to find the right mix of veterans and young players. There's always there are always takeaways to have. And on Saturday, Stuart Skinner had himself probably his best game of the regular season. And some of that is the game itself, the 4:00 Eastern start time. When players are used to routines, it's very easy for them to get out of whack. And a Saturday matinee game at home is one of the things that will get you out of whack. I thought the Oilers started pretty slowly. It took them a while to kind of get their feet under them, for lack of a better expression. And Skinner was up to the task. And you're not going to expect Stuart Skinner to be able to do that with any real frequency, because that's just not what you're paying for. That's just not realistic. And again, that's not to say Stuart Skinner is bad. I don't think Stuart Skinner is a bad goalie. I think he's slightly above average. I think if things break right and he's having a particularly good night, he's good. But I think most nights you're going to get 902, 903 save. I think on some nights he can be positive and steal you a goal. I think some nights he'll give one back. It's really a sign of the volatility of the position. But again, the Oilers feel that the goaltending market, especially in the middle and the lower end of things, there is so much variance that it doesn't make sense to spend a lot on the position unless you can find a way to get one of those marquee guys, because there's so much variance from game to game when you're not an elite goalie. What you get from the Cam Talbots of the world, those types of players, they're always going to go out there. The goalie carousel every summer matters. There will always be goalie movement because teams, when you have one of those guys who's just fine and nothing special, they consistently cycle through because teams are constantly looking to marginally improve. And Skinner is still young enough where there might be a little bit more juice to squeeze there. But I most nights know that if the Oilers play well enough in front of him, they're going to win the game. That's not a ringing endorsement, but that's enough. And you think about the playoff run last year, you think about the performances at that juncture. He outplayed Jake Ottinger in the Western Conference Finals last year. That matters. The Oilers gave up 74 scoring chances, 5.8 expected goals, and were out high danger chanced on Saturday. Stuart Skinner won them that game. To be 5.8 expected goals against and only concede 2, he stole 3 goals against. That matters. When you have a goalie that on occasion can flash at that level, that's important. That matters. And it speaks to what we talked about in that first segment, the idea of some nights it's going to be Stuart Skinner. Not often, but some nights. And some nights it's going to be Nuge. And some nights it's going to be Zach Hyman and Adam Henrique and Victor Arvidsson. Everybody has to pick up slack at varying points. And that's the sign of a really good team, is the fact that you have all of these different players who can contribute for a game here or there over the course of a season. And I think that's a good example of what depth looks like. I know I did an episode of the show last week talking about, are the Oilers going to score enough? Well, I do think there are some questions about the Oilers scoring, especially in the secondary area of the team once you get past the big five. But they have enough quality where I feel like it becomes a matter of execution and luck as opposed to, well, they're not that good. So we're going to take one more break on today's show. When we come back, we'll set the table for McDavid's return to the lineup tonight against the Kraken and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Victory Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. As I said, we'll have an episode for you tonight as soon as the game against the Kraken goes final. I am excited to see how McDavid plays. Anytime you get an impromptu 3-day week-long vacation like McDavid did, and it was funny, him saying, well, I can't just go to Cancun for the week. He probably could have, in all honesty. If McDavid told the Oilers, hey, I'm going to go away for the week because I'm not getting an all-star break because I'm going to be the face of Team Canada at Four Nations next month, I think the Oilers honestly probably would have let him go to Cancun for a week. Him and Lauren could have just hung out, brought Lenny, and not did anything. But Connor's a good teammate. He was there with the defenseman in practice. I think it was on Friday. I am ready to see how much better the Oilers can get ahead of the trade deadline. And we're about 5 weeks away from the NHL trade deadline. Deadline's March 5th. The month of February is where we see teams prove, establish, and ascertain. And what I mean by ascertain, this is your last shot to find out if you have any internal candidates for solutions to your problems. We see the Oilers are giving Noah Phillips some run. I'm glad to see that. We're going to see some different forward combinations, I would imagine, whether it be Skinner staying in, whether it's McDavid coming back in and Skinner going out, or Kapanen going out. Whatever the Oilers end up doing, it is important that they use the month of February to try and figure out what exactly they still think they need. And teams have already put together their pro personnel stuff for the deadline. They've identified what types of players they want, what players fit those archetypes that might be available. The NHL, that process starts in like December. You spend the month of December and January kind of feeling out where the market's at, identifying players you're interested in. And then February is where it becomes time to get real, where teams that might be in the mix. And look, this year in particular is weird because especially in the East, basically nobody other than the Sabres are fully out of it, which means teams are going to be reticent to trade that far ahead of the deadline because if they feel like they're still in the mix and they only need a good week to get back in the hunt, they don't want to trade those pending UFAs. They want to keep people engaged. They want their fans to keep showing up. They want their players to feel like the season's not over because as soon as you trade a pending unrestricted free agent, that tells the rest of the room your season's over. That tells everyone else, well, we're going to try our best, but we know we're not probably making the playoffs, and no one wants to do that. So teams wait as long as they possibly can to accept that they have to sell at the deadline. And because of that, it makes it harder to execute these trades as early as you would like. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. Last year, we saw the Flames trade Elias Lindholm well ahead of the March 5th deadline to the Canucks. Every few years, there's one. You know, the Flames had traded for Tyler Toffoli ahead of the trade deadline a couple of years ago. If you can pull it off and make the trade happen earlier, the better. That gives these guys more time to get acclimated. That's always one of the first anecdotes you hear about a player after the season when they're acquired at the deadline is, well, it took me a little while to figure out what I needed to do here. I need to adapt. And something NHL teams in particular are very guilty of is acquiring a player without really having a vision for how to implement them. Look at the Oilers and Jeff Skinner. And look, I understand that Jeff Jackson did free agency and then Stan Bowman was hired in August. So I can cut the Oilers a little bit of slack there in terms of not being fully aligned in identifying talent and fit. But a lot of teams just look at, is this guy good? Does he have traits we like? And say, we'll figure out what we can do with him. You know, he's going to fit in our system because X, Y, and Z. And I think you want to have a bit more of a specialized approach in terms of this guy is good at X, Y, and Z. We think he can do this for us. We want a guy with a great motor because we need another forechecker. We're going to play him with Connor Brown, Henrique, and Janmark. We're going to try and have 2 third lines and raise the floor of the bottom half of our lineup. There are options out there. You know, you want to try and find guys that both fit what you want to do and also can fit what you already do. It's important that you think about the fit when you go out and acquire a player and try and ascertain how good you can find them. Talent, physical talent itself is to some degree innate. You know, a great athlete is great because of their genetics, but they have to refine it. They have to work at it. They have to develop it. And just because you are good at one thing in one place does not necessarily mean you will be successful doing that somewhere else. There are how many guys who get signed on July 1st or traded at the trade deadline who go to their new teams and look like shells of themselves because they don't fit. They don't fit because their talent is not being put in a position to succeed. Last thing, this is a little bit of a stretch run here. You got 6 games, then you get a week and a half, 2 weeks off for Four Nations. The Oilers are well represented at Four Nations. I'm sure Leon is going to enjoy his time off. It's always nice when you can get out of the All-Star game, and that's effectively what Four Nations is an All-Star game facsimile. But you want to get good stretch of R&R. The Oilers are going to get there. Their best players are going to be busy. Connor's going to be busy. Zach Hyman very well might be an injury replacement. Matthias Ekholm will be very busy. The Oilers definitely have work to do, but you take those opportunities to reset when you can. And even if it's only some of the guys in your lineup, I'm sure, and I promise you, everybody is varying degrees of sore and everyone is varying degrees of tired. Getting a week and a half off in the middle of the season, that matters. That's valuable, especially a team as old as the Oilers. And one last thought on that. We'll see how long it takes for John Klingberg to get in the lineup. I am really curious to see what he looks like. He says he's in no physical discomfort and he feels the best he has in a few years. I want to see how well he can play. I want to see him out there. I want to see the mobility. I want to see his dexterity in terms of moving left to right, his lateral agility. I want to see him skate. I want to see how his stride looks. There are a lot of little components that I'm very curious to see a guy who basically hasn't played a full season in like 3-4 years at his age. You know, it's a guy in his mid-30s now who doesn't have a ton of NHL left. What does he have left? I'm very curious to see. That'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live. I will talk to you guys tonight after the game. I'll see you guys then. And until then, let's go Oilers.